On Christmas Eve, my father disowned me with a chilling calmness, as if striking a line from a contract. "My life will be better without you in it," he said. I did not cry. I just left. 36 hours later, his attorney called in a panic about a legal issue destroying his legacy-defining deal. The ultimate irony was that kicking me out of the family made me the exact and only person capable of stopping it all. My name is Valerie Montrose. I pulled my sedan into the long driveway of my family's ancestral stone house in the suburbs of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Just as the afternoon light began to fade on Christmas Eve, the sky promised a harsh winter storm, but the true cold was already waiting inside those thick masonry walls. I arrived early to help prepare the holiday dinner, a tradition I upheld out of a stubborn sense of duty. For the past 6 weeks, the atmosphere inside our home had been pulled tight, vibrating with the tension of a monumental financial transaction. My father, Grant Montrose, was a man currently intoxicated by the scent of his own impending victory. For months, he had been negotiating the sale of 147 acres of prime family-owned real estate situated right against the lucrative Interstate 78 corridor. The buyer was Halcyon Ridge Logistics, an aggressive commercial development firm intent on transforming our generational woodlands into a sprawling concrete regional distribution center. If the deal closed before the 31st of December, my father would walk away with tens of millions of dollars. He paraded through the house that evening in a tailored wool suit, holding a crystal tumbler of expensive bourbon, acting as though he had already conquered the world. The dining room table was set for 5. The good silver was polished, the crystal glasses caught the dim light of the chandelier, and a massive prime rib roasted in the kitchen, filling the air with a heavy, savory scent. Yet, no one was actually celebrating Christmas. They were celebrating Halcyon Ridge. My mother, Evelyn, floated around the perimeter of the room, obsessively adjusting napkins and centering candlesticks. She had spent her entire adult life curating the image of a flawless, upwardly mobile family, and this sudden influx of corporate cash was her ultimate validation. My younger sister, Sloane, sat on the velvet sofa by the fireplace, her eyes glued to the glowing screen of her tablet. She was rapidly scrolling through listings for commercial retail spaces in downtown Philadelphia, already planning a massive expansion for her boutique using money that did not yet legally exist. We finally sat down for dinner at exactly 7 o'clock. The conversation was immediate and entirely focused on the closing schedule. The buyer's lenders were pushing for a rapid resolution to secure end-of-year tax incentives, meaning every piece of paper had to be flawless and executed immediately. That was when my father turned his attention to the final roadblock. "Valerie," Grant said, his voice cutting cleanly through the soft clinking of silverware against porcelain. "I need you to sit down with your grandmother after dessert. I need you to make her sign the trust amendment tonight." I stopped cutting my meat. I looked down the long mahogany table. My grandmother, Ruth Montrose, sat quietly at the far end, her frail hands resting in her lap. She was 82 years old, and while her mind was still highly capable, she had grown easily overwhelmed by aggressive demands. The amendment my father was pushing her to sign was a sweeping legal document that effectively dissolved several protective covenants established by my late grandfather. It was designed to remove any potential hurdles for the logistics company, but it also stripped the family trust of its most vital legal safeguards. "No," I replied, my voice completely flat and devoid of hesitation. The dining room fell entirely silent. My mother paused with her wineglass halfway to her lips. Sloane finally looked up from her screen. Grant placed his heavy silver fork onto his plate. The metal rang sharply against the china. "Excuse me." I said no. I repeated, looking directly into my father's eyes. "I am not going to corner an 82-year-old woman on Christmas Eve and pressure her into signing a complex legal waiver that she does not comprehend. You have not explained the long-term liabilities of that amendment to her. I am not going to act as your enforcer just to satisfy Halcyon's aggressive timeline." Sloane let out a loud, theatrical sigh. "God, Valerie, Why do you always have to be such a nightmare? It is just a piece of paper. You are literally the only person making this difficult. It is a legal forfeiture of generational rights, Sloan, I stated, keeping my tone perfectly measured. It is not a permission slip for your shopping spree. I expected my father to shout. I expected the red flush of anger to creep up his neck, followed by the booming, authoritarian voice he used to intimidate his employees at his landscaping supply company. But he did not raise his voice. What he did was far worse. Grant leaned back in his heavy oak chair and looked at me with a chilling, clinical detachment. His eyes were dead. It was the exact look of a ruthless businessman identifying a structural liability and deciding, without a single shred of emotion, to demolish it. "You know," Grant began, his tone smoother and colder than the ice clinking in his bourbon glass, "you have always been the anchor dragging behind the hull of this family. Every single time we build any upward momentum, you are right there, standing in the middle of the road, demanding we stop. You demand we check the brakes, check the foundation, check the paperwork. You paralyze us with your endless, suffocating caution." My mother lowered her gaze to her lap, refusing to intervene. She chose her luxury over her eldest daughter. "I manage risk," I answered softly but firmly. "I keep this family from drowning in its own negligence." "You suffocate my ambitions," Grant corrected me, his voice dropping into a low, absolute register. "I am building an empire here. I am securing an incredible future for this family, an entire new chapter. And I am entirely exhausted from constantly having to defend my vision to you. I am tired of you ruining our upward trajectory." He placed both of his hands flat on the table, leaning forward slightly. "In fact, looking at you right now, I realize something very clearly," he said, speaking slowly so every syllable landed like a physical blow. "My life, and the life of this family, would be significantly better if you were no longer in it." The words hung in the warm, pine-scented air. They were absolute. There was no alcohol fueling them, no sudden flare of temper. It was a calculated, strategic amputation. "You have no vision," Grant continued calmly. "You only see limitations. So, we are finished. From this exact second onward, you no longer have a voice in this house. You no longer have the right to question or interfere in the decisions of this family. You are out." I did not gasp. I did not cry. My heart rate barely even elevated. Standing there in the suffocating silence, I simply experienced a profound, crystal-clear moment of realization. This was the inevitable conclusion of a decade-long dynamic. For 10 years. They had ruthlessly utilized my professional expertise to quietly clean up their messy contracts, fix their boundary disputes, and ensure their chaotic financial schemes did not land them in court. But the moment my expertise required them to slow down, I became the enemy. I was a disposable asset, but Grant wanted to ensure the execution was flawless. He wanted the humiliation to be a matter of permanent public record. He reached into the breast pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out his smartphone. He tapped the glowing screen 3 times, his face devoid of any expression, and then placed the device face down on the tablecloth. Exactly 4 seconds later, my phone vibrated in my pocket. Sloane's tablet chimed loudly from the sofa. My mother's phone lit up beside her wine glass. "I instructed Nolan to prepare the draft adjustments 48 hours ago," Grant informed the room, referencing Nolan Pierce, our longtime corporate and family attorney. "I just gave him the authorization to distribute them." I reached into my pocket and retrieved my phone. There was a new email in my inbox from Nolan's prestigious law firm, sent to our entire family distribution list. The subject line read, "Draft revisions to Montrose Trust and estate beneficiary allocations." I opened the attached document. It was a formal, legally binding draft that effectively zeroed out my financial inheritance rights and completely severed my equity in the Montrose Family Corporation. My father had treated the act of disowning his own daughter as a mere administrative checklist item, executed over a plate of prime rib. I locked my phone screen and slipped it back into my pocket. I stood up from my chair. I did not throw my linen napkin onto the floor. I did not slam my fists on the table or demand an apology. I did not shed a single, pathetic tear. I simply looked at the people sitting around that table. I saw a father blinded by greed, a mother hollowed out by vanity, and a sister spoiled into absolute delusion. "I wish you all a very good evening," I said softly. I turned my back on the dining room and walked deliberately toward the front foyer. I retrieved my heavy black wool coat from the closet and slid my arms into the sleeves. I slung my leather tote bag over my shoulder. I opened the heavy front door and stepped out into the freezing Pennsylvania night. The door clicked shut behind me, severing me from my bloodline. Thick, heavy snow was falling rapidly, already covering the windshield of my car. I started the engine, turned the heat on high, and backed out of the driveway without a single glance in the rearview mirror. They believed they had won. They truly believed they had just ruthlessly eliminated the only obstacle standing between them and a mountain of corporate cash. What they failed to comprehend was that the massive, complex land deal was resting entirely on a foundation of fractured titles, unresolved easements, and severe compliance violations. The only thing preventing that entire multi-million-dollar structure from collapsing into dust was my constant, invisible labor. They thought they had just fired an annoying subordinate. They did not realize they had just evicted the only architect capable of reading the blueprints. At 8 o'clock the next morning, sitting alone in the quiet sanctuary of my city apartment, I officially and permanently withdrew my name, my license, and my labor from every single document supporting that transaction. And by 7 o'clock the following evening, it was my father's attorney who became the first person to call me in a state of absolute, unmitigated panic. To understand how we arrived at that freezing Christmas Eve, you have to understand the currency of the Montrose family. It was not love, and it was certainly not loyalty. The currency was pure utility. For the past 8 years, I have worked as a senior land use and title compliance manager at Astor Vale Infrastructure Group, headquartered in Center City, Philadelphia. My job is not glamorous. It does not look impressive on a social media feed, and it rarely makes for riveting cocktail party conversation. I specialize in the unearthing of microscopic legal landmines hidden deep within the bedrock of massive commercial real estate transfers. I handle boundary discrepancies, unrecorded rights of way, archaic restrictive covenants, severed mineral rights, and the endless chain of title defects that can blow a $100 million development project completely out of the water when a corporate buyer wants to pave over a century of history to build a warehouse. I am the one who ensures the ghosts of past owners cannot emerge to sue them. To my family, this made me a glorified file clerk. Grant frequently described my career to his country club acquaintances with a dismissive wave of his hand. He would tell them that Valerie just sits in a cubicle looking at old maps and papers all day, usually right before boasting about his own tangible, earth-moving business. Yet, the hypocrisy was a living, breathing entity in our household. The second my father received a commercial lease agreement, a complex contractor addendum, or a vague property tax reassessment, my phone would ring. It was never a polite request. It was an absolute expectation. He would forward legal documents pushing 300 pages with a one-line email commanding me to review everything by the morning and make sure he was not walking into a trap. Sloan would dump commercial lease drafts for her boutique on my kitchen counter, demanding I analyze the indemnification clauses before her weekend trip. They openly mocked the tedious nature of my profession, but they were utterly addicted to the bulletproof armor it provided them. The truth about my father's empire was something only he, his accountant, and I fully understood. Grant Montrose cultivated the aesthetic of a self-made titan. He owned Montrose Stone and Outdoor, a landscaping and hardscaping supply company that operated a fleet of heavy trucks and massive loaders. Yeesh. He wore steel-toed boots to the office and drove an $80,000 pickup truck to project an aura of rugged, undeniable success. But I had seen the internal ledgers. The company was being hollowed out from the inside. The shiny yellow front-end loaders and the massive excavators were not actual assets. They were financial anchors. They were leased at punishing interest rates, sometimes upwards of 18%, eating away at profit margins that were already razor-thin. Fuel costs, supply chain delays, and aggressive regional competitors had reduced his actual take-home profit to a mere fraction of what he pretended it was. My mother, Evelyn, actively ignored this decay. She was a woman who believed that if you looked wealthy enough, reality would eventually catch up to the facade. She aggressively maintained her expensive salon appointments, her charity gala committee memberships, and the pristine condition of her luxury vehicle. She needed the narrative of the upwardly mobile Montrose family to remain completely intact. Sloane was even worse. My 24-year-old sister operated under the delusional assumption that the pending land sale had already closed. She was signing letters of intent for a massive retail space in a highly gentrified neighborhood, talking loudly about ordering $50,000 worth of imported inventory. She treated the anticipated windfall as if the cash was already resting securely in her personal checking account. This was exactly why the Halcyon Ridge logistics deal was not just a business transaction for my father. It was his desperate, breathless escape hatch. If he could sell that acreage before the 1st of January, he would not just clear his suffocating equipment debt. He would instantly transform his entire identity. He would graduate from a struggling, blue-collar supply yard owner to a highly liquid, wealthy land baron. He could stand in the clubhouse and casually mention that he was entering a bigger, more sophisticated chapter of his life. The land was his golden ticket out of the financial prison he had built for himself. But the property was not a simple, clean square of dirt waiting to be handed over. And I was the only person in that house who grasped the terrifying fragility of what he was trying to sell. The 147 acres near the interstate were a jurisdictional nightmare. The footprint was stitched together from 7 different fractional parcels acquired over 6 decades. Some of the land was held directly by the Montrose Family Limited Liability Company. Other vital sections were inextricably tied up in the generational family trust established by my grandfather back in the 1980s. The property lines drawn on the county tax maps did not align with the physical stone walls built in the 1920s. Selling it required an absolutely flawless orchestration of deeds, waivers, trust modifications, and environmental clearances. One missed signature, one overlooked access easement, and the buyer's title insurance company would instantly pull the plug on the entire transaction. In the corporate real estate world, my name carried a very specific, undeniable weight. When the underwriting banks, the commercial surveyors, and the title insurance agents for Halcyon Ridge saw that Valerie Montrose had personally reviewed the chain of title and the compliance schedule, the collective tension in their boardrooms would drop. They knew my reputation at Astor Vale. They knew I did not miss a single misplaced comma or a buried liability clause. They relaxed because I was the gold standard for risk mitigation. My family, however, despised my caution. They hated the uncomfortable questions I forced them to answer. They hated when I demanded they produce decades-old death certificates, or when I flatly refused to let my father backdate a corporate board resolution to save time. I was the hand yanking them back by the collar just as they were trying to sprint across a busy highway blindfolded. They wanted the thrill of the run. They deeply resented me for pointing out the oncoming traffic. It took years of reviewing their contracts, fixing their impulsive mistakes, and shielding them from massive civil liability for me to finally understand my true position in the family hierarchy. The realization did not happen all at once. It was a slow, agonizing erosion of hope. I would sit at my dining table at 2 o'clock in the morning, cross-referencing my father's commercial loan covenants while he slept soundly in his massive house. And I would feel the cold, hard truth settle permanently into my bones. In their eyes, I was not a beloved daughter. I was not a cherished older sister. I was an appliance. More accurately, I was the invisible support holding their lives together. They depended on that support every day without ever acknowledging it. They complained when I slowed them down. But they never once considered what would happen if I stepped away. And on that Christmas Eve, when my father decided the steel was too rigid and too restrictive for his grand, reckless design. He simply ordered it removed. He thought the bridge would stand purely on the strength of his arrogance and my mother's denial. He had absolutely no idea that the concrete was already cracking, and without me there to hold the tension, the entire structure was destined to fall apart. The physical reality of the 147 acres bordering Interstate 78 was deceivingly simple to the naked eye. It was just a sprawling expanse of dense Pennsylvania timber, sloping gently toward a state highway. But on paper, in the county recorder of deeds office, it was a jigsaw puzzle assembled in the dark by a dozen different careless hands over the span of 80 years. Halcyon Ridge Logistics was not paying for timber. They were paying for a perfectly flat, legally sterile canvas to pour 1 million square feet of concrete and erect a mega warehouse. They needed the entire package sealed and delivered before the stroke of midnight on December 31st. The corporate buyer had locked in a massive state tax subsidy that expired precisely at the end of the calendar year. That artificial deadline was the drumbeat driving my family into a collective frenzy, pushing the tempo of the transaction far past the limits of standard legal diligence. When I finally gained access to the complete digital data room in late November, the thrill of the impending payout had already blinded everyone else in my family. I bypassed the glossy architectural renderings and went straight into the raw title commitments and historical surveys. It took me exactly 3 nights of cross-referencing to find the fractures. There were not just minor clerical errors. There were 4 massive, fatal defects buried in the chain of title. First, the boundary descriptions of the 3 central parcels did not mathematically close. A surveyor in 1952 had measured from a submerged creek bed that had since dried up and shifted, leaving a 40-foot wide phantom strip of land running right through the center of the proposed loading docks. No one actually owned that strip, which meant Halcyon could not legally build over it. Second, I uncovered an unvacated right-of-way for an agricultural road dating back to 1938. It had not been used in decades, but legally. A neighboring farm still held the absolute right to drive a tractor directly through what would soon be the warehouse security gate. The third defect was entirely emotional, which in real estate law makes it infinitely more dangerous. Tucked into the far northeast corner of the tract was a small, walled family cemetery. The graves belonged to my great-great-grandparents. A deed from 1912 explicitly guaranteed perpetual ingress and egress for all direct descendants to visit that site. Halcyon's current site plan had a massive stormwater retention basin completely swallowing that access route. You cannot simply pave over a statutory graveyard access right without triggering a massive legal injunction. The fourth and final nail was environmental. The southern edge of the property dipped into a recognized wetlands transition area. The buyer's engineers had aggressively calculated their maximum buildable square footage, completely ignoring the state-mandated riparian drainage buffer zone. If the environmental regulators caught wind of the true topography, Halcyon would lose at least 12 acres of developable space, triggering a massive price reduction clause in the purchase agreement. These were not issues you could simply gloss over with a fast-talking broker. In the world of commercial infrastructure, these were full-stop emergencies. But the legal defects were only half the nightmare. The true horror emerged when I started auditing the administrative folders my father had recklessly uploaded to the shared server. I found a series of email threads between Grant and the underwriting team at a major regional commercial bank. The bank was providing a short-term bridge loan to keep my father's landscaping company solvent until the land deal funded. In those emails, Grant explicitly stated that all family encumbrances and title anomalies had been fully resolved and legally cleared. He had put it in writing. He was using the anticipated, unverified proceeds of a critically flawed real estate transaction to hold off his aggressive corporate creditors. He was borrowing against a complete mirage. The financial infection had spread to my sister as well. Sloan had leveraged the exact same false promises. I found a signed letter of intent on the kitchen counter for her new retail boutique space. The monthly rent was $15,000. She had already wired a non-refundable deposit of $45,000, pulling the cash from a high-interest personal line of credit. I saw invoices for imported Italian fixtures and custom velvet seating. She was spending a fortune she absolutely did not possess, floating entirely on the toxic fumes of our father's desperate confidence. 72 hours before that catastrophic Christmas Eve dinner, I attempted to stop the runaway train. I requested a formal meeting with my father in his home office. I printed out the surveys, highlighted the boundary gaps in fluorescent yellow, and placed the 1912 cemetery deed squarely on his leather blotter. I explained, with absolute precision, that if we submitted the current title package to Halcyon Ridge's attorneys, their underwriters would immediately spot the discrepancies. If one single link in this chain snaps, I warned him, keeping my voice perfectly level, they will not just delay the closing, they will initiate a forensic audit of the entire site. They will demand environmental retesting. The lender will freeze the escrow funds, and when your bridge lender realizes you lied about the title being clear, they will call in your company loans within 30 days. I expected panic. I expected him to ask me how to fix it, how to draft the necessary quitclaim deeds, or negotiate a quiet title action to clean up the mess. Instead, Grant looked at me as if I had just tracked mud across his pristine carpets. "You are intentionally manufacturing problems," he snapped, shoving the meticulously tabbed folders away from him. "The buyer's team has been looking at this dirt for 6 months. No one has brought up a farm road from 1938. No one cares about a strip of wetlands. You are just terrified of seeing this family actually succeed." "I am terrified of federal wire fraud and breach of contract," I replied coldly. "You are spending ghost money. If you push this through without curing the defects, you are going to lose the land, the business, and everything else." He stood up, towering over his desk, his face a mask of rigid fury. "I have managed complex business operations my entire life. I know how to navigate acceptable risk. The only liability threatening this transaction right now is your relentless, suffocating pessimism. We are closing next week. You will sign off on the compliance summary, or I will find someone who will." That was the exact moment the final fracture occurred. He did not want a legal shield anymore. He wanted a blind accomplice. I flatly refused to sign off on the fraudulent compliance summary. My refusal was the direct catalyst for the ambush he orchestrated 48 hours later over the prime rib. He decided that if I would not validate his lies, I had to be permanently excised from the narrative. He needed to prove to the banks and the buyers that the family was completely unified, even if it meant amputating a limb to make it look that way. So, on Christmas Eve, he brought the axe down. He legally severed me from the bloodline, stripped my equity, and kicked me out into the freezing snow, entirely convinced he had just removed the only obstacle in his path to absolute financial victory. But as I drove away from that stone house, watching the snow bury my tire tracks in the rearview mirror, my mind was not on the boundary lines or the wetlands buffer. My mind was fixated on a single, archaic paragraph buried deep within the original 1980s trust documents. It was a fail-safe mechanism my grandfather had drafted decades ago, a clause I had discovered only 2 days prior and had not yet had the opportunity to explain to my father. Grant thought he had just permanently locked me out of the family vault. He had absolutely no idea that by officially disinheriting me before the assets were liquidated, he had just unknowingly handed me the only key. On the morning of the 25th of December, the sun rose over a completely silent city. The snowstorm from the previous night had covered the streets in pristine, unbroken white. Inside my apartment, the air was warm and still. I did not turn on the television. I did not play holiday music. I brewed a single cup of black coffee, sat down at my glass dining table, and opened my laptop. It was precisely 7 o'clock in the morning. The first step of a controlled demolition is severing the electrical lines. You have to cut the power before you detonate the charges. In the realm of commercial real estate compliance, the power is liability, as long as my name remained attached to the Halcyon Ridge transaction. I was absorbing my family's liability. I was their human shield. I opened a new blank document and began to type. I did not use anger. I did not use emotion. I used the sterile, surgical language of absolute legal detachment. The memo was addressed to Nolan Pierce, our family attorney. I added the lead underwriter at the title insurance company, the chief surveyor, the buyer's corporate counsel, and the primary loan officer at Grant's Bridge Bank to the carbon copy line. Sending a business email on a major holiday is generally considered aggressive, but when dealing with a $100 million year-end closing, everyone is checking their phones. I needed the detonation to happen simultaneously across the entire grid. The subject line was devoid of festive greetings. It read, "Notice of immediate withdrawal of counsel and revocation of document verification," in the body of the email. I constructed a fortress of deniability, I stated, clearly and unequivocally, that effective immediately. I was no longer consulting, reviewing, verifying, or coordinating any aspect of the pending land sale. I detailed that I had been formally removed from all family business operations by the primary principal, Grant Montrose, and therefore, my professional oversight had been permanently terminated. The next paragraph was the most critical. It was the kill switch. I explicitly wrote that any previous notes, preliminary drafts, or verbal assurances I had provided were strictly limited to the information available at that specific time and were now officially void. I expressly prohibited anyone from referencing my past involvement as a guarantee of current compliance. Furthermore, I demanded the immediate removal of my name, my credentials, and my implied approval from any outstanding title commitments, trust schedules, or compliance summaries. I was revoking their license to use my professional reputation to soothe their nervous investors. I read the text twice. It was airtight. There was no room for interpretation, and no opening for a panicked phone call asking for one last favor. It was final. Before I pressed send, I executed the second phase of my protocol. I opened the cloud-based data room where all the transaction files were housed. I spent the next 2 hours downloading complete, time-stamped archives of every single folder. I saved the metadata. I recorded the access logs, showing exactly who had viewed which document and when. I took high-resolution screenshots of the exact state of the files as I was leaving them. If my father or Nolan attempted to alter a document or backdate my signature or digital footprint, I now had forensic proof that could expose the fraud and protect me in court. At exactly 9 o'clock, I attached the formal withdrawal memo to the email. I moved my cursor over the send button. I felt no hesitation, no residual guilt. I clicked it. The silence in my apartment remained unbroken, but I knew the digital shockwave was already traveling through fiber optic cables, waiting to detonate in the inboxes of half a dozen highly anxious lawyers and bankers. The first tremor registered exactly at 12 noon. I was standing by my kitchen window, watching the snow plows clear the avenue below, when the notification chimed on my laptop. It was an automated alert from the shared data room. The lead underwriter from the title company had just uploaded a high-priority flag regarding a boundary addendum for the central parcel. Normally, this would trigger an immediate text message from me to Nolan, telling him exactly which historical deed to reference to satisfy the underwriter's concern. But I was no longer in the loop. I simply watched the notification sit there, in the stone house in Bethlehem. I could picture the exact sequence of events. Nolan would receive the flag. He would call my father. My father, completely illiterate in the nuances of meets and bounds descriptions, would open the file, stare at the dense, archaic legal jargon, and realize he was looking at a foreign language. The boundary addendum required synthesizing 3 different surveys from 3 different decades to explain a 40-foot discrepancy for 10 years. I had been the sole translator of that language. Now, they were staring at a blank wall. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the tremors escalated into structural shaking. Another alert flashed on my screen. The independent surveying firm had submitted a formal inquiry directly to Nolan and the buyer's counsel. They had reached the section of the family trust schedule that dealt with the acreage allocations. The surveyor bluntly asked why the legal description of the trust assets provided by Grant did not mathematically align with the physical parcel map they had just generated. This was the exact discrepancy I had warned my father about 72 hours earlier. I knew exactly how Grant would attempt to handle it. He would try to bluster his way through. He would probably call the surveyor, turn on his rugged masculine charm, and attempt to bulldoze the issue. "Listen, it is just an old clerical error from the county," Grant would likely say, his voice booming with false authority. "We are all completely aligned here, so let us just push the paperwork through and get this closed." But a licensed commercial surveyor does not care about a landscaping supply owner's confidence. They care about liability, trigonometry, and their professional license. Grant's usual tactic of overpowering people with his sheer presence would crash spectacularly against the cold, hard mathematics of property law. For the first time in his career, his aggressive confidence was entirely insufficient to reassure the people holding the pen. The sun set early, casting long, dark shadows across my living room floor. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I sat in the quiet dimness, illuminated only by the glow of the city through the glass. At 6 o'clock, my phone, resting face up on the coffee table, began to light up. The screen displayed an incoming call from Grant. I let it ring. It stopped, then immediately started ringing again. This time it was Evelyn, then Sloan, over the next 2 hours. The screen illuminated in a frantic, desperate rhythm. My father called 4 times. My mother called twice. My sister, likely realizing her retail boutique deposit was suddenly evaporating, called 3 times in rapid succession. Then came the numbers I did not have saved in my contacts, but whose origins I could easily guess. They were Philadelphia area codes, corporate numbers, likely Nolan Pierce calling from his private cell. Or perhaps an associate from the title agency desperately trying to bypass the formal email and beg me for a 5-minute clarification. The digital onslaught was a symphony of their mounting terror. The artificial timeline they had constructed to secure their massive payout was rapidly collapsing because the foundation they had built it on was completely hollow. I reached out, picked up the phone, and turned it face down on the polished wood of the table. The vibrations muted against the heavy timber. I walked into the kitchen and began the methodical process of grinding fresh espresso beans. The harsh, loud grinding noise was a comforting contrast to the frantic silence of my phone. As the dark, rich liquid dripped into my porcelain cup, a profound sense of clarity washed over me. For a decade, they had convinced themselves that I was the problem. They believed I was the friction slowing down their inevitable rise to immense wealth. But standing there in my quiet kitchen, I realized the absolute truth. I had not sabotaged them. I had not actively destroyed their monumental transaction. I had not planted explosives at the base of their precious empire. All I had done was step backward. I had simply stepped back from the system I had been holding together for years. I did not push anything over. I just stopped protecting them from the consequences of their own decisions. At exactly 8:15 on the morning of December 26th, my mobile phone vibrated sharply against the granite surface of my kitchen counter. I had slept for 8 solid hours. The screen illuminated, displaying a Philadelphia area code and the direct office line of Nolan Pierce. I let it vibrate 3 distinct times, listening to the harsh buzzing sound echo in the quiet apartment, before I calmly picked it up and accepted the call. "Valerie," Nolan said the moment the connection opened. The single word rushed out of his mouth, lacking all of its usual expensive polish. For the 10 years I had known him, Nolan Pierce had always spoken with the smooth, measured baritone of a man who billed $1,000 an hour and never felt a single ounce of panic. He was a master of the country club legal negotiation, a man who smoothed over corporate friction with expensive scotch and vague promises. But this morning, his breath was shallow, his voice was frayed at the edges. He sounded exactly like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was frantically trying to grab a handful of air. "Good morning, Nolan," I replied, my voice as flat and unyielding as a sheet of ice. "Valerie, please tell me you have a few minutes to talk." He stammered, entirely ignoring the customary pleasantries. "We have a severe situation on our hands. The Halcyon Ridge transaction is facing massive, highly critical legal and financial issues. The buyer's funding syndicate just hit the brakes hard. They are refusing to authorize the next escrow phase. The entire deal is freezing over." I leaned against the counter and took a slow sip of my coffee. I did not ask him what the issues were. I already knew the structural integrity of that deal was compromised. I only needed to confirm one specific detail regarding their actions over the past 24 hours. "Nolan, I'm going to ask you a very direct question, and I expect a completely unvarnished answer," I said, cutting through his nervous rambling. "Did my father, or did you, submit the final environmental and title compliance schedules to the underwriting banks yesterday afternoon using my professional credentials? Did you present my name in that package after I explicitly revoked my authorization in writing at 9 o'clock yesterday morning?" The silence on the line was profound. It was a thick, suffocating pause. It was the exact sound of a veteran attorney realizing his malpractice insurance might not cover an act of deliberate documentary fraud. "Grant felt," Nolan started, his voice cracking slightly under the pressure. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Your father believed that because most of your risk assessment had been completed before your withdrawal email, your earlier sign-off still applied. He instructed the team to push the package through to maintain the buyer's confidence. That is not a valid carryover of authorization." "Nolan," I said, my tone perfectly controlled, "that is intentional misrepresentation. It is documentary fraud. And you, as transaction counsel, allowed him to submit a falsified title package." "Valerie, you have to listen to me," Nolan pleaded, the desperation finally bleeding through his expensive facade. "The compliance schedule is not even the most dangerous fire burning right now. The fraud issue is secondary to what we discovered late last night." I placed my coffee cup down. "Explain." "When Grant called me on Christmas Eve and ordered me to execute the documents to formally remove you from the family estate, he forced me to do something we have not done in 2 decades, Nolan said, the words spilling out in a rapid, anxious stream. "I had to go down into the firm's basement archives and pull the original, wet ink trust charter that your grandfather drafted back in the 1980s. I had to review the foundational covenants to ensure the disinheritance was completely bulletproof before I sent that email out to the family." "And what did you find in my grandfather's charter?" Nolan. I could hear him shifting papers on his desk, his breathing erratic. "Your grandfather was a deeply cynical man, Valerie. He apparently anticipated a scenario where one generation might attempt to cannibalize the others to liquidate the land. Buried deep in Section 4. Paragraph B of the original charter. There is a protective covenant. It is a highly irregular fail-safe mechanism." Nolan paused, as if gathering the physical strength to say the next sentence out loud. "The clause states that if any direct lineal descendant is punitively or intentionally struck from the schedule of beneficiaries prior to the legal dissolution and distribution of the principal real estate asset, that specific excluded descendant immediately and irrevocably transitions into a mandatory protective signatory." I closed my eyes, letting the absolute genius of my late grandfather wash over me. The old man had known exactly who his son was. He knew Grant possessed the capacity for boundless greed, and he had quietly built a steel trap door right into the foundation of the family wealth. "What exactly are you telling me?" "Nolan," I asked, forcing him to articulate the trap. "I am telling you," Nolan whispered, "that the disinheritance document your father forced me to send you on Christmas Eve did not erase you from the transaction. It did the exact opposite. By formally disowning you, Grant triggered the failsafe. You are no longer just a passive beneficiary waiting for a check. You are now the ultimate legal bottleneck. Halcyon Ridge cannot buy the property. The banks cannot mortgage the property. And your father cannot transfer a single square foot of that dirt unless you personally sign the execution deed. You hold the absolute veto power over the entire $100 million transaction. The poetic justice of the situation was cold and heavy. My father had stood in his dining room, looked me in the eye, and ruthlessly cut me out of his life because he thought I was standing in his way. He thought he was tossing an annoying deckhand off his ship. He didn't realize he had just let go of his only support, leaving himself trapped by the very thing meant to hold him steady. But that is still not the end of it, Nolan continued, his voice dropping into a register of sheer defeat. Because the closing timeline suddenly stalled, Halcyon's primary lenders initiated a secondary stress test on the seller's financial health. They started digging into Grant's corporate posture. They found the bridge loans, I said. It was not a question. They found everything, Nolan confirmed. They discovered the email threads where Grant explicitly used the projected, unclosed value of the Halcyon deal to pacify his corporate creditors at Montrose Stone and Outdoor. He was aggressively leveraging money he did not legally possess to hold off the equipment leasing companies. Halcyon's funding syndicate absolutely despises cross-collateralized risk. They see a desperate seller trying to use their clean money to plug a sinking ship. They are threatening to walk away from the table entirely by Friday. The noose was tightening, exactly as I had warned my father it would. The structural decay was no longer hidden beneath the floorboards. It was breaking through the ceiling. Valerie, I am in a corner here, Nolan begged. I need you to come down to my office in the city this afternoon. I have drafted a very narrow, highly specific, single-use waiver. It temporarily suspends your mandatory signatory rights under your grandfather's protective covenant. It is just enough to stabilize the buyer's confidence and allow us to close the Halcyon deal before the 31st of December. If we close, your father stays out of corporate bankruptcy. Your sister does not default on her commercial retail lease. We can negotiate a highly favorable, private financial settlement for you immediately after the funds clear. He was asking me to jump back onto the sinking ship just to plug the hole my father had blasted through the hull. He wanted me to sign a blind document, validating a fraudulent process, to save a man who had casually discarded me less than 48 hours prior. You want me to sign a waiver to rescue a fundamentally compromised transaction, I stated softly. I am asking you to save your family's legacy from complete annihilation. Nolan pleaded. I am not your compliance officer anymore, Nolan, I replied, the steel returning to my voice. I am not your risk manager, and I am certainly no longer your invisible shield. You and my father built this explosive device all by yourselves. Now you get to sit in the room while it detonates. Valerie, please, you cannot just let this fail. The collateral damage will destroy Grant. If you have a formal legal proposition regarding my signatory rights under the trust covenant, I said, dictating the terms of engagement, you will put it in writing and send it via certified mail to my home address. Do not call this number again. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button to end the call. I set the device down on the kitchen counter. The apartment was completely silent once more. I picked up my coffee, walked over to the large glass window, and watched the city wake up, feeling the absolute, undeniable weight of power resting entirely in my own hands. Word of my father's delusion reached me late on Thursday afternoon through a back channel. Despite the catastrophic structural failures Nolan had admitted to me over the phone, Grant was entirely unwilling to relinquish the optical high ground. A former colleague of mine, a senior underwriter who frequented the same high-end real estate circles, sent me a brief, coded text message. Grant was hosting a private, closed-door mixer at a restored historic hotel in downtown Easton that very evening. The guest list included the Halcyon Ridge regional directors, 2 managing partners from their primary lending syndicate, and a handful of wealthy local brokers. My contact mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that my father was actively using my professional reputation to soothe the room. He was walking around with a highball glass, smoothly assuring the nervous capital partners that the Montrose family title experts had personally sanitized every inch of the closing schedule. He was parading my ghost around the room to guarantee his payday. I made the decision to attend within 60 seconds. I did not want a screaming match. I did not want a dramatic, tearful family reconciliation. I simply wanted to sever the invisible tether that allowed him to keep profiting off my name in rooms from which I had been formally banished. I selected my wardrobe with the same precision I used to draft a legal severance. I chose a tailored charcoal wool suit, a stark white silk blouse, and black leather heels. It was armor masquerading as evening wear. It was simple, sharp, and projected absolute, unshakable authority. I drove the winding state routes toward Easton as the evening temperature plummeted. The historic hotel was a monument to old money, featuring vaulted ceilings, dark mahogany paneling, and the faint, expensive scent of aged bourbon and floor wax. The mixer was held in a private, glass-enclosed lounge overlooking the frozen river. A hired jazz trio played softly in the corner, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to what was essentially a desperate financial charade. I walked past the velvet rope and the hostess stand without breaking my stride. I did not check my coat. I stepped into the warm, buzzing room and immediately blended into the shadows near the heavy velvet drapes. I let my eyes adjust to the low, amber lighting, scanning the clusters of tailored suits and designer dresses. It did not take long to locate Grant. He was standing near the center of the room, holding court with a group of 5 men whose postures screamed institutional wealth. Nolan Pierce stood slightly behind his right shoulder, looking distinctly pale and thoroughly miserable, nursing a mineral water. Grant, however, was in his element. He was expansive, smiling broadly, using his hands to paint a picture of undeniable success. He looked exactly like the titan of industry he so desperately wished to be. I moved slowly, circling the perimeter of the room, deliberately remaining just outside of his peripheral vision. I glided behind a group of regional brokers, positioning myself just a few feet away from my father's circle. I wanted to hear exactly how he was selling my labor. "This is a transformational deal, gentlemen." Grant's voice boomed over the soft jazz, radiating a toxic, infectious confidence. A monumental leap forward for the Montrose legacy and for the entire Lehigh Valley logistics corridor. We are talking about opening up a completely new chapter of regional development. One of the lending partners, an older man with silver hair and a sharp, skeptical gaze, swirled his drink. "Grant, we appreciate the vision, but our risk management committee is naturally anxious about the end-of-year timeline. Pushing a transaction of this magnitude through the final compliance hoops in less than 5 days is an incredibly tight needle to thread. Are you absolutely certain the back end is clean?" Grant offered a warm, reassuring chuckle. It was a masterpiece of theatrical deception. "I assure you, the foundation is solid bedrock. We run a very tight ship. Our internal family team has spent the better part of a year scrubbing those schedules. The family records have been thoroughly vetted by the best title mind in Philadelphia. Everything is perfectly aligned." The sheer audacity of his lie was the exact cue I needed. I stepped out from behind the brokers and walked directly into the open space of their circle. I did not rush. I moved with the slow, deliberate pacing of a judge entering a courtroom. The men in the circle naturally parted, their eyes drawn to the sudden, sharp shift in the room's energy. Nolan saw me first. The blood instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Grant turned his head. A charming smile still plastered across his features, ready to greet a new admirer. When his eyes locked onto mine, the smile did not just fade, it shattered. I did not look at my father. I looked directly at the silver-haired lending partner. My voice was not loud, but it possessed a cold, acoustic clarity that cut straight through the ambient noise of the lounge. "Has everyone here been informed," I asked, "that this transaction cannot legally close without the mandatory signature of the exact same daughter he formally disowned on Christmas Eve?" The air in the lounge instantly froze. The soft jazz playing in the corner suddenly felt absurdly loud against the absolute. suffocating silence that descended upon our circle. The men holding their expensive drinks turned entirely rigid. The representative from Halcyon Ridge, a sharp-featured corporate buyer who had been nodding along to Grant's pitch seconds earlier, snapped his head toward Nolan. "Nolan, what exactly is she talking about?" Nolan swallowed hard, his throat working nervously against his tight collar. "Gentlemen, this is simply an internal family matter that is currently being resolved." "Is there a trust dispute on the underlying title?" the silver-haired lender demanded, his voice dropping an octave, the polite country club veneer vanishing in an instant to reveal the ruthless banker underneath. "Because if there is a clouded title or a beneficiary dispute, we are pulling our funding authorizations tomorrow morning." Grant finally found his voice. It was a harsh, strained whisper, devoid of its previous booming authority. "Valerie, you need to leave. Right now." I finally shifted my gaze to my father. I saw the absolute terror swimming behind his eyes. He was standing in a room full of the only people who could save him, and I was holding the match. I turned back to the syndicate of lenders, ensuring my posture remained perfectly relaxed and professional. I was not a scorned daughter throwing a tantrum. I was a senior compliance officer delivering a fatal risk assessment. "Since we are discussing thorough vetting," I continued, my words striking like precise hammer blows against glass, "I am curious if the buyer's counsel has been fully briefed on the active ingress and egress rights to the 1912 family cemetery located squarely within the proposed development footprint. And more importantly, I wonder if the underwriting team has reviewed the descendant exclusion clause in the original 1980 trust charter. The clause that explicitly grants the disinherited party absolute veto power over the sale of the principal estate." The silver-haired man physically took a step back from Grant, as if my father had suddenly contracted a highly contagious disease. The Halcyon Ridge buyer set his drink down on a passing waiter's tray with a sharp, angry clatter. "We are pausing all wire transfers," the lender said, looking directly at Nolan, ignoring Grant entirely. "We want a complete, unredacted copy of that trust charter on my desk by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. If there is a single undisclosed lien or veto right, we are walking away from the table, and we will be seeking damages for bad faith negotiations." I had delivered the fatal injections. There was nothing left to say. I did not wait for Grant to attempt a pathetic defense, nor did I stay to watch Nolan try to salvage the wreckage. I simply offered a polite, abbreviated nod to the bankers. "Gentlemen, enjoy your evening," I said softly. I turned on my heel and walked back across the plush carpet of the lounge. No one tried to stop me. No one raised their voice. The destruction I left in my wake was entirely silent, but it was absolute. As I pushed through the heavy wooden doors and stepped back out into the freezing night air, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. When I had arrived, Grant Montrose was the king of the room. By the time the heavy doors clicked shut behind me, not a single person in that lounge was looking at him with anything other than pure, unadulterated financial disgust. 2 days later, the battlefield officially shifted. Nolan Pierce did not suggest a family sit-down at the Stone House in Bethlehem. Instead, his legal assistant sent a formal calendar invite for a late-morning meeting at his Center City, Philadelphia law firm. That single geographical change was a massive concession. It meant the situation had entirely breached the containment of a domestic dispute. It was no longer a family argument. It was a high-stakes corporate crisis. I arrived precisely at 11 o'clock in the morning. A silent, nervous receptionist escorted me into a glass-walled conference room overlooking the frozen Delaware River. They were all waiting for me. Grant sat at the head of the long mahogany table, wearing a dark suit, though his usual imposing posture was noticeably deflated. Evelyn sat to his right, her hands tightly clasped in her lap, wearing a designer cashmere sweater that looked entirely out of place in a room designed for legal combat. Sloane was slouched next to our mother, aggressively chewing on her lower lip. Nolan sat at the opposite end, flanked by a massive, intimidating stack of freshly printed legal documents. The papers were fanned out purposefully, creating the illusion that everything could be instantly repaired if I simply picked up a pen and let my anger go. I took the single empty chair directly across from my father. I did not take off my coat. "Valerie," Grant began, attempting to deploy the warm, paternal tone he had completely abandoned on Christmas Eve. "Thank you for coming. I know the past few days have been incredibly tense. We all said things we regret." I stared at him, my expression perfectly neutral. I did not offer him a single syllable of encouragement. "It was just a momentary flash of anger," Grant continued, leaning forward and resting his forearms on the polished wood. "The stress of the Halcyon Ridge timeline, the end of the year approaching, the pressure from the lenders." I snapped. "I made a rash, emotional decision that I deeply apologize for." "It is the pressure of the holiday season, darling," Evelyn chimed in quickly, her voice trembling slightly. "Families fight. It happens to everyone. But we are blood. We just need to put this ugly business behind us and move forward together." Sloane could not contain her venom. She slammed her hand flat against the table. "You are literally destroying our entire future because you are too stubborn to accept an apology. Valerie, you humiliated Dad in front of his investors. You are actively trying to ruin us just to prove a point." I let Sloane's words echo off the glass walls. I looked at the three of them, sitting there with their desperate, fabricated narratives. They truly believed they could manipulate me back into submission with a cheap apology and a guilt trip. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I reached into my leather tote bag and retrieved a thick, perfectly organized manila folder. I opened it and began to deal the contents across the mahogany table, like a blackjack dealer laying out a losing hand. "This is the access log for the secure data room," I stated, sliding a heavily highlighted spreadsheet toward Nolan. "It clearly shows that at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the 25th of December, 5 hours after I formally withdrew my legal counsel, someone operating under Grant Montrose's administrative credentials downloaded my previously certified environmental compliance summary." I slid a second piece of paper across the table. It was a high-resolution screenshot. "This is a copy of the final package submitted to the Halcyon Ridge Underwriting Syndicate on the morning of the 26th, I continued, my voice echoing like cold steel in the quiet room. "Right there, on page 42. My name and my state license number are listed as the primary verifying authority for the title clearance." Grant's jaw tightened. Evelyn looked down at her lap. "You did not make a rash, emotional decision on Christmas Eve," I said, looking directly into my father's eyes. "You made a calculated business maneuver. You believed that by officially terminating my involvement, you could push a fundamentally flawed, fraudulent package through the banking system without my interference, while simultaneously stealing my professional credibility to secure the funding." I turned my gaze entirely to Nolan. The attorney was sweating through his expensive dress shirt. "Nolan," I said softly, plunging the knife exactly where it needed to go. "We both know the banks rejected the initial package after the incident at the hotel. We both know they demanded a newly executed consent form directly from me due to the trust covenant. Tell me exactly what Grant asked you to do yesterday morning when the lenders threatened to pull their capital." Nolan looked terrified. He looked back and forth between Grant and the door, like a trapped animal. "Tell them, Nolan," I commanded, leaving zero room for evasion, "or I will forward these time-stamped logs directly to the State Bar Association Ethics Committee before noon." The threat of losing his law license was the ultimate breaking point. Nolan collapsed. "Grant asked me," Nolan whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. "He asked me if there was a way we could extract a previous, wet ink signature of yours from an older trust document. He wanted to know if we could legally reference it, or digitally transpose it onto the new Halcyon Ridge consent waiver, just to get the wire transfers initiated." The conference room died. All the oxygen was instantly sucked out of the space. Evelyn gasped out loud. A sharp, ragged sound. Sloane froze, her mouth slightly open. We had crossed a massive, terrifying boundary. This was no longer a toxic family dynamic. This was a conspiracy to commit felony forgery. It was the kind of desperate, reckless behavior that put men in federal prison, and no corporate attorney in the world wanted to be in a room where that kind of evidence was being openly discussed. "You asked your lawyer to forge my signature on a $100 million real estate transaction," I stated, letting the absolute weight of his crime settle over his head. Cornered, stripped of his authority and his excuses. The grand illusion of Grant Montrose finally shattered. His face turned a deep, mottled red. But it was not from anger. It was the panic of a drowning man who had just run out of air. "I had no other choice," Grant erupted, his voice cracking, the polished businessman completely vanishing. "The equipment leasing companies are threatening to seize the entire fleet by the 15th of January. The corporate tax liabilities from last year are completely delinquent. I am drowning in penalties. I promised the regional suppliers a massive cash injection by the first week of the new year. I leveraged the Halcyon Ridge money to keep the supply yard operating. If this deal does not fund, the company goes into receivership. I lose everything." The truth spilled out of him like toxic sludge. He was completely broke. He had been running a massive, elaborate shell game, using the promise of the land sale to borrow more money to pay off the interest on his existing debts. Sloane suddenly burst into loud, hysterical tears. Her tough, entitled exterior completely dissolved. "I signed the lease," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "I signed the commercial lease for the boutique. It is an ironclad 5-year guarantee. I ordered $200,000 worth of Italian inventory. The vendors require full payment upon delivery next week. Dad promised me the money would be in my account by Friday. If it is not there, they are going to sue me. They are going to bankrupt me before I even open." Evelyn just sat there, staring blankly at the polished wood table, her entire curated universe collapsing into ash around her. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the sheer magnitude of their collective financial ruin. They had built an entire empire of debt on the back of a single, highly precarious real estate deal. And in that silent, shattered room, I finally understood the most agonizing, but ultimately liberating truth of my entire life. My father did not look at me across the dining room table on Christmas Eve and disown me because he fundamentally hated me. He did not cut me out of the bloodline because I was a difficult daughter. He disowned me because I was the only person in his life who possessed the technical expertise to read the ledger and the moral backbone to refuse to participate in his fraud. I was the only person who understood the files well enough to see the trap he was building. He needed absolute, unquestioning compliance to execute his desperate scheme. And he knew he would never get it from me. He tried to execute me professionally because I was the only thing standing between him and the prison cell he was actively building for himself. The ultimate tragedy was that he failed to realize I was also the only person smart enough to keep him out of it. The collapse did not happen in a single, explosive moment. There were no dramatic sirens, no sudden crashes, and no immediate bankruptcies. True financial ruin, especially the kind built on decades of arrogant leverage, is much quieter. It is a slow, methodical, and unimaginably expensive bleeding. Within 48 hours of the disastrous meeting in Nolan Pierce's conference room, the Halcyon Ridge executive team officially shifted their entire posture. The transaction was no longer classified as a high-speed, priority year-end closing. It was abruptly downgraded to an active corporate liability. The buyer's legal counsel issued a formal notice of reevaluation. The risk had fundamentally mutated from what they previously assumed was a minor internal family dispute into a catastrophic title defect and a severe signatory hazard. Halcyon immediately revoked their reliance on any summary document my father or Nolan had previously provided. They deployed their own independent auditing teams to the site near Interstate 78. These experts did not care about Grant Montrose's desperate timelines or his manufactured confidence. They only cared about raw, undeniable data. An independent commercial surveying firm arrived on the property during the first week of January. They spent 4 days measuring the exact topography and cross-referencing historical deeds against the physical earth. Their final report was utterly brutal. They mathematically confirmed that the legally mandated access route to the 1912 family cemetery could not be bypassed, relocated, or paved over. It sliced a massive, unbuildable diagonal line directly through the proposed footprint of the primary logistics facility and the staging areas for the loading docks. Worse yet, the updated environmental impact study concluded that the seasonal wetlands bordering the southern edge were significantly larger than Grant had originally claimed on his initial site assessments. The state-mandated riparian buffer zone consumed another 8 acres of the property. In the harsh, unforgiving mathematics of commercial real estate, every lost square foot of developable land directly reduces the valuation. The 147 acres were rapidly shrinking in utility, and with them, the purchase price plummeted by nearly 30%. The immediate consequence of this shrinking valuation was the total freeze of the financial supply lines. The buyer's lending syndicate officially placed all bridge financing on an indefinite hold until the trust signatory dispute was entirely resolved and the new site plan was approved. The anticipated December 31st wire transfer, the phantom millions my father had been using to hold his aggressive creditors at bay, simply evaporated into thin air. This triggered a devastating, cascading chain reaction for Montrose Stone and Outdoor in the tight-knit regional construction and landscaping supply industry. The smell of financial distress travels faster than a winter storm. Grant had spent the entire fourth quarter promising his major material suppliers that a massive cash injection was arriving right after the holidays. When the second week of January arrived and the commercial accounts remained completely empty, the corporate grace periods vanished. Vendors who had happily extended net 60 or net 90-day payment terms for a decade suddenly changed their accounting policies overnight. They demanded cash on delivery for every single shipment of gravel, premium mulch, and imported paving stones. Without raw materials, the company could not fulfill its early spring contracts. The heavy equipment leasing companies, sensing the mounting instability, began sending aggressive daily audit requests for their excavators and loaders, laying the administrative and legal groundwork for full repossession. The atmosphere inside my father's company headquarters turned incredibly grim. The veteran foreman and senior logistics managers, men who had worked for Grant for 15 years, stopped looking at him with respect. They watched him pace his glass-walled office, his face pale, constantly shouting into his mobile phone at bankers who were no longer taking his calls. The seasoned employees recognized the undeniable posture of a sinking captain. He was no longer the steady, aggressive titan of industry who guaranteed their livelihoods. He was a deeply compromised man who was actively dragging their entire careers down into the abyss with him. Morale collapsed, and 2 of his top sales directors quietly submitted their resignations before the end of the month. The contagion of failure did not stop at the supply yard gates. It infected Sloane's world with ruthless, terrifying speed. Her entire business model for the retail boutique was predicated entirely on the illusion of limitless family wealth. When the land deal stalled, a silent investor she had courted, a minor local socialite who had only agreed to participate because she wanted proximity to the rumored Montrose family windfall, suddenly became severely spooked. The investor's attorneys legally exercised a 90-day exit clause and completely pulled her seed capital. Sloane was left standing entirely alone in a massive, empty commercial space in downtown Philadelphia. She was legally bound to an exorbitant 5-year lease she could not possibly afford to break without triggering personal bankruptcy. The imported Italian display fixtures and the expensive designer inventory began arriving at the loading docks, accompanied by massive freight invoices requiring immediate payment. Her delusion fractured completely, leaving her trapped beneath a mountain of aggressive personal debt with absolutely no revenue stream to service it. She left me 3 voicemails, each one escalating from demands to pleas, but I simply deleted them without listening to the end. For my mother. The ruin was not immediately financial, it was deeply social, which to Evelyn was infinitely worse than losing money. She desperately attempted to maintain her pristine image within her affluent circles. She continued to attend her charity committee luncheons and high-end salon appointments, smiling brightly and discussing the mild winter weather as if her husband was not facing corporate insolvency. But the elite social ecosystem operates on highly accurate, whispered intelligence. The rumors of Grant's desperate display at the Easton Hotel had spread rapidly through the country club locker rooms. The invitations to exclusive dinner parties and weekend galas slowly began to thin out. When she did encounter her peers at the club, their interactions fundamentally changed. They were perfectly polite, greeting her with tight, measured smiles and brief nods. But the conversations remained incredibly shallow. The women she considered her closest allies suddenly found urgent reasons to excuse themselves after only 2 minutes of small talk. This polite, sanitized distance was agonizing. No one confronted her. No one asked about the land deal. They simply let her know, with surgical social precision, that they were entirely aware the Montrose family was no longer financially viable or trustworthy. They were silently cutting her out of the herd to protect their own status. She was becoming a ghost in her own life, while their respective worlds slowly collapsed around them. I remained safely inside my apartment in the city. I continued to go to my office at Astor Vale Infrastructure Group every morning. I drank my black coffee, meticulously reviewed my complex files, and watched the gray winter days turn into cold, clear nights. For the first time in my 36 years of existence, I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not feel the crushing, familiar, deeply ingrained urge to step in, analyze the damage, and draft a miraculous legal remedy to save them from themselves. I realized that for my entire adult life, I had been standing directly between my family and the natural consequences of their own reckless actions. I had been absorbing the massive impact of their greed, constantly mistaking my professional utility for actual familial love. I had let them treat me like a machine, simply because I was afraid of what would happen if the machine stopped working. Now, the shield was completely gone. I was simply observing the harsh, inevitable gravity of reality taking hold. I was not plotting their downfall. I was just refusing to prevent it. Sitting alone in the quiet warmth of my living room, I felt incredibly light. It was the quiet, profound, and deeply satisfying peace of finally allowing a rotting structure to fall exactly as it was always meant to. By the 3rd week of January, the Halcyon Ridge transaction was officially on life support. The constant frantic calls from my family had ceased, replaced by a desperate, chilling silence. Then, the final trap was laid. It arrived at my apartment via a private courier on a Tuesday afternoon, a thick legal-sized envelope bearing the embossed logo of Nolan Pierce's law firm. Inside was a drafted settlement agreement. It was Nolan's last agonizing attempt to salvage his own reputation and my father's empire. The terms were explicit. If I signed a comprehensive, retroactive waiver validating all previous compliance schedules and formally relinquishing my veto power under the trust covenant, I would receive a private, untraceable cash disbursement of $750,000. They were calling it a peace solution in the cover letter. In reality, it was a bribe. They were trying to buy my silence and my signature with the very money they did not yet possess. Simultaneously, Grant deployed a completely different tactic. He realized rage and intimidation had failed, so he pivoted to the only weapon he had left: weaponized guilt. My phone buzzed with a long, unpunctuated text message from him. He did not mention the money or the bank. Instead, he named his employees. He told me that Marcus, his lead dispatcher of 15 years, had a daughter starting college in the fall. He mentioned that the yard foreman had just taken out a second mortgage. "If you do not sign the waiver," my father wrote, "I am shutting down the supply yard on the 1st of February. 62 people will lose their livelihoods, and it will be entirely your fault. Do not do this to them." He was attempting to shift the absolute moral weight of his decades of gross financial mismanagement squarely onto my shoulders. He wanted me to believe that my refusal to commit fraud was the reason innocent families would suffer. I did not reply to the text message. I did not sign the settlement offer. Instead, the following morning, I drove out to the suburbs of Bethlehem. I had been monitoring my mother's social calendar, which I still had access to on my phone, and I knew she was attending a mid-morning charity board meeting. I also knew Grant was entrenched at his failing corporate office, fighting off creditors. The stone house would be empty, except for the one person everyone else had conveniently ignored for months. My grandmother, Ruth, was sitting in the sunroom, wrapped in a thick wool shawl, staring out at the frost-covered gardens. At 82 years of age, she was physically fragile, but her mind remained as sharp as cut glass. She had watched the chaos unfold over the past month in absolute silence, a ghost in her own home. When I walked into the room, she did not look surprised. She simply patted the empty space on the floral sofa next to her. "I knew you would come eventually, Valerie," Ruth said softly, her voice barely louder than the rustling of the bare branches against the window panes. I sat down beside her. For the first time since Christmas Eve, I felt the heavy, defensive armor around my chest begin to loosen. "They are trying to bribe me, Grandma. And when that does not work, Dad is trying to make me feel responsible for his employees." Ruth let out a slow, tired sigh. "Your father has always viewed the truth as a highly flexible concept. He views this land the exact same way. To him, it is not history. It is not our blood or our legacy. It is just an automated teller machine waiting to be smashed open so he can cover his own mistakes." She slowly reached into the deep pocket of her wool cardigan and retrieved a sealed, yellowed envelope. The paper was brittle, and the edges were frayed from years of being hidden away. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. It was my grandfather's precise, architectural script. "Your grandfather was a brilliant man, but he carried a very heavy burden," Ruth explained, handing the envelope to me. "He saw the reckless ambition in Grant very early on. He knew that one day Grant's ego would write a check his business could not cash. He was terrified Grant would sell the land right out from under us to save his own pride." I stared at the sealed flap. "Yo. He gave me this letter 30 years ago," Ruth continued. "He gave me very specific instructions. I was only to open it, or give it to the right person. If someone in this house ever attempted to permanently sever a direct descendant from the bloodline just to force a property sale, he knew Grant would eventually try to cut someone out to clear the board." I carefully slid my finger under the brittle adhesive and opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of heavy stationery. I read my grandfather's words. The message was not a sentimental goodbye. It was a flawless, strategic legal directive from beyond the grave. My grandfather explicitly clarified the intent behind the punitive exclusion clause. He wrote that the mechanism turning an exiled descendant into the mandatory transaction protector was never designed to be a punishment for the family. It was designed to be the ultimate circuit breaker. It was an emergency lever intended to completely halt a panic-driven sell-off orchestrated by a compromised trustee. The letter explicitly stated that if the trustee was attempting to liquidate the generational asset to cover personal or outside corporate liabilities, he was operating in direct violation of his fiduciary duty to the bloodline. The legal implication of that single, handwritten page was staggering. It completely shifted the balance of power. I left the stone house with the letter secured inside my coat. I did not go back to my apartment. I drove straight to the offices of an elite, independent trust litigation attorney in Center City, Philadelphia, a woman I had worked across from on several hostile acquisitions. I paid her retainer up front from my own savings. Over the next 72 hours, operating under the strict confidentiality of attorney-client privilege, we initiated a forensic audit of the Montrose family trust ledgers, cross-referencing them with the public filings of my father's landscaping company. What we uncovered was a terrifying labyrinth of deceit. At Nolan Pierce's office, Grant had confessed to using the anticipated land sale to hold off his immediate equipment creditors, but the reality was infinitely worse. My father had actively used the projected valuation of the Halcyon Ridge deal as verbal and undocumented collateral for multiple, massive, high-risk financial obligations over the past 3 years. He had cross-collateralized the ancestral land to secure private mezzanine loans, aggressively gambling the family legacy to cover horrific operational losses at Montrose Stone and Outdoor. He was not just trying to fix a bad quarter. He had been systematically bleeding the trust dry to feed his failing empire. My independent counsel looked at me across her desk, surrounded by stacks of highlighted financial disclosures. "Valerie," she said, her voice laced with professional awe, "your father has committed an egregious, undeniable breach of his fiduciary duty. He has actively engaged in unauthorized self-dealing. This completely changes the game." I nodded slowly, absorbing the absolute power of the weapon I was now holding. "You do not just have the right to block the Halcyon Ridge transaction by withholding your signature," the attorney explained. "You have the direct, legal standing to petition the state court to have Grant Montrose involuntarily stripped of his title as the primary trustee. You can completely remove his executive authority over the family estate. You can take the land away from him entirely." It was the ultimate trump card. It was the leverage that changed everything. Nolan Pierce's office had already scheduled what they were calling a final, decisive settlement conference for the upcoming Friday. They demanded my presence, alongside the Halcyon Ridge representatives and the Trust Council. They were operating under the desperate assumption that I would walk into that room and either finally soften under the weight of the massive cash bribe, or stubbornly refuse and watch the family burn. They thought the board only had two possible moves left. I locked the original copy of my grandfather's letter and the forensic audit binders in my leather briefcase. I did not send a counteroffer. I did not respond to the emotional blackmail texts. I let the silence stretch out, thick and terrifying, allowing them to marinate in their own anxiety. I was going to let them walk into that boardroom completely blind, entirely unaware that the daughter they had casually discarded on Christmas Eve was no longer just the roadblock. I was the executioner. The settlement conference room on Friday morning felt less like a legal negotiation and more like a hostage exchange. The massive glass table was completely surrounded. On one side sat the Halcyon Ridge executive team and their aggressive corporate litigators. On the other side sat Nolan Pierce, my father, my mother, and Sloan. Positioned squarely at the head of the table was a senior partner from a neutral fiduciary firm, acting as the independent trust counsel. Everyone in that room operated under the exact same assumption. They believed I had walked through those double doors to either quietly accept a $750,000 bribe or stubbornly detonate the entire transaction out of pure spite. Grant decided to play his final, desperate card before I even sat down. He stood up, smoothing the front of his tailored suit jacket, attempting to project the magnanimous aura of a weary patriarch. "I want to clear the air before we begin," Grant announced, his voice carefully modulated to sound sorrowful yet commanding. "We have all endured a tremendously stressful few weeks. I will be the first to admit that things went entirely too far over the holidays. Passions ran high, but at the end of the day, we are a family. We are sitting at the precipice of a monumental legacy. Valerie, I am asking you to look past the anger. I am asking for one signature, right here, right now, to save our family from total ruin." I did not interrupt him. I let the pathetic, hollow echo of his half-hearted apology die against the glass walls. I took my seat slowly, placing my heavy leather briefcase on the polished wood. Nolan Pierce leaned forward, pushing a thick stack of finalized waivers and the private cash settlement agreement across the table toward me. "Valerie," Nolan prompted, his voice tight with anxiety, "what is your decision?" I did not reach for his pen. I opened the brass clasps of my briefcase. I withdrew the brittle, yellowed envelope and the thick binder containing the forensic audit generated by my independent counsel. I placed them squarely in the center of the table. "My decision is that Grant Montrose is no longer legally fit to sit at this table," I stated, my voice completely devoid of emotion, cutting through the room like a scalpel. Grant's face hardened. Sloan let out a sharp, theatrical scoff. I slid the original, handwritten letter from my grandfather across the table toward the Independent Trust Council. That is a direct mandate written by the original grantor of the family estate, I explained, maintaining absolute eye contact with the Trust Council. It explicitly clarifies the intent of the Descendant Exclusion Clause. The mechanism turning a disinherited family member into a mandatory protective signatory was never drafted as a punishment. It was a calculated fail-safe designed to stop a compromised trustee from liquidating generational land to cover personal liabilities. Nolan turned incredibly pale. The Halcyon Ridge executives suddenly sat up very straight. "And this," I continued, sliding the heavy forensic audit binder directly on top of the letter, "is irrefutable proof of those liabilities. A comprehensive audit of Grant Montrose's corporate ledgers over the past 36 months. It documents, in agonizing detail, that he has actively engaged in unauthorized self-dealing. He cross-collateralized the anticipated value of the family trust land through verbal and undocumented guarantees to secure extremely high-risk mezzanine loans for his failing supply business. He did not disown me because of a family argument. He illegally removed me from the bloodline because I refused to facilitate his massive, structural fraud." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a kingdom collapsing. The Independent Trust Council opened the binder. He scanned the highlighted financial disclosures, his expression shifting from professional curiosity to profound legal disgust. He closed the binder and looked directly at my father. "Mr. Montrose," the Trust Council said, his tone icy and formal, "based on this preliminary evidence of gross fiduciary breach and self-dealing, you are immediately suspended from your duties as the primary executive trustee. A neutral third-party administrator will be appointed by the state court this afternoon to assume total control over the remaining assets." Grant collapsed back into his chair as if he had been physically struck. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The illusion of the great businessman was entirely shattered, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, bankrupt man. The lead attorney for Halcyon Ridge immediately seized the shift in power. He closed his own file folder with a sharp snap. Given the severity of this trust dispute and the confirmed environmental and topographical limitations of the site, Halcyon Ridge Logistics is officially withdrawing our comprehensive purchase offer, the corporate lawyer declared. We are no longer interested in the 147-acre package. However, to salvage the sunk costs of our preliminary engineering, we are prepared to offer a severely reduced, revised contract. We will purchase only the 22 acres of commercial highway frontage. The core legacy land is entirely off the table. The massive life-changing windfall simply vanished into thin air. The tens of millions of dollars Grant had promised his creditors. The cash Sloan had already spent. The wealth Evelyn used to justify her arrogance, it was all gone in a matter of seconds. Nolan looked at me, completely defeated. "Valerie, without the full sale, the proceeds will barely cover the corporate tax liens. There will be nothing left for the family." "That is exactly the point, Nolan," I replied. I did not use my veto power to burn the entire forest to the ground. I used it to dictate the terms of survival. I turned to the newly empowered Trust Council and laid out the unbreakable conditions of my signature for the revised, drastically smaller land sale. "The funds from the 22-acre commercial frontage sale will be heavily restricted," I commanded. "The primary allocation will entirely clear the federal and state tax liens threatening the estate. The secondary allocation will establish an untouchable, irrevocable trust specifically designated to fund the lifelong medical and residential care of Ruth Montrose. The tertiary allocation will go directly to severances and pension guarantees for the veteran employees of Montrose Stone and Outdoor who are about to lose their jobs due to corporate insolvency." I paused, looking directly at my mother and sister. Evelyn was weeping silently into a linen handkerchief. Sloan was staring at the table, her face a mask of absolute, paralyzing shock. "Absolutely no funds from this transaction will be distributed to Evelyn Montrose to maintain her social obligations," I stated firmly. and not a single cent will be allocated to rescue Sloane Montrose from the commercial retail debts she recklessly incurred. The remaining acreage, including the family cemetery and the wetlands, will be immediately placed into a permanent, restrictive conservation easement. It will never be developed. Grant sat frozen, his eyes hollow. He had walked into that hotel in Easton bragging about a transformational deal that would elevate his name. Now he had to sit in silence and watch it reduced to a tightly controlled damage control agreement administered by total strangers. He had lost his company, his reputation, and his control over the land. I stood up, closing my empty briefcase. I did not wait for their tears or their rage. There was nothing left in that room for me. As I walked toward the heavy glass doors, the ultimate irony settled deeply into my bones. On Christmas Eve, as we stood in our family dining room, my father met my gaze and flatly stated that his life would be far better if I weren't part of it. In the end, the most devastating, expensive thing he ever lost was not the commercial land, the millions of dollars, or his country club prestige. The most expensive thing he lost was the one and only person smart enough and brave enough to stop him from completely destroying himself. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you'd like more stories like this, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications.